This is the story of Air Transat Flight 211. On the 5th of March 2008, an Air Transat Airbus A310 was making the flight from Quebec International Airport to Montreal International Airport. This was the final leg of a two-leg flight. Earlier on in the day, the plane had come in from Paris. On the ground at Quebec, 139 passengers got off, and now the plane had 9 crew members and 89 passengers on board for the flight to Montreal. At 2:15 p.m., the plane was authorized to taxi to runway 06 and to fly the standard instrument departure, or SID-2 departure, out of Quebec. As the plane taxied, the crew did a few control checks to make sure that the plane was responding to the control of the pilots really well. Since no issues had been found, the pilots started to set the plane up for the upcoming takeoff. But at 2:38 p.m., the crew got new departure instructions. Now, after taking off from runway 06, they had to turn right at a heading of 110 degrees and then level off at 3,000 feet, and then contact the Quebec terminal. This meant that the crew had to go over some new manuals, but it wasn't anything that the trained crew could not handle. This was, after all, routine. At 2:39 p.m., the captain took the engines to max power, as what was required of him for taking off from a contaminated runway. As an easterly wind buffeted the plane, the Airbus A310 picked up speed as it thundered down the runway at Quebec. Within seconds, they were airborne, and Flight 211 continued to pick up speed. As they were climbing away, the pilot put the plane into a right-hand bank to turn onto the heading that the controller had given them. As the plane gained altitude, the flaps and gear were retracted and the autopilot was engaged. The nose of the plane at this point was at about 19 degrees. They were climbing at 6,300 feet per minute. This plane was climbing pretty aggressively. For some context, at this point the plane should have been at about 10 to 12 degrees of pitch. But just 5 seconds after the autopilot came on, the captain disconnected the autopilot, and the autopilot disconnect warning filled the cockpit. As the plane closed in on 3,000 feet, the nose of the plane started to drop. At 3,100 feet, the plane stopped climbing and then started to descend. It then started to pick up speed. The descent rate at first was 2,000 feet per minute. As they crossed through their assigned altitude of 3,000 feet, the first officer warned the captain that they were in a nose-down position, and the captain pulled back on the yoke in an attempt to get the plane to respond. But still, the nose stayed down, and Flight 211 picked up speed and screamed towards the ground. In the cockpit, the pilots pulled back power on the engines in an attempt to get the speed of the plane under control. If they kept this up, the flaps on their wings would be ripped clean off. But the opposite happened. The engines were ramping up to a higher power setting, sending the plane even faster. They were now at 2,800 feet and running out of altitude. The first officer again warned the captain that the plane was diving, but the captain was so focused that he did not respond. Now the control panel was lit up with caution lights. The first officer saw that nothing was changing, and he told the captain that he had control. The captain let go of the yoke. The first officer was swift. He disabled the autothrottle and pulled power back to 45%. The plane was now going 260 knots in a dive and accelerating. But despite this, the plane nosed down even more to 6.7 degrees. They were now just 1,454 feet off the ground, and the EGPWS, or the Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, went off, letting them know that they were sinking too fast. That warning was joined by an overspeed warning as they pushed past 345 knots. The sink rate warning was then replaced by a don't sink terrain warning, and then by a too low terrain alert. You get the picture. Flight 211 was running out of time. The pilots pulled back in a desperate attempt to save the plane, and they slowly started to bottom out of the dive. At an altitude of 995 feet above the ground, they started to climb again. The pilots fought to keep the plane in the climb, and the captain put out a pan and told the air traffic controllers that they had an airspeed indication issue and asked to climb to 10,000 feet so that they could do a little bit of troubleshooting. After cross-verifying the speed of the aircraft with departure controllers at Quebec, the pilots decided to push on to Montreal. After all, the ECAM displays were clear and nothing else seemed wrong. So they canceled the pan and landed in Montreal without further incident. The next day, Air Transat went to the Canadian Transport Safety Bureau and went, "Hey, one of our planes lost a bit of altitude during a wind shear event." Once the TSB started looking into this, they realized that something was off. The weather at the time of the incident did not call for winds that were very strong, and nothing that would approach a wind shear event that would take off a few thousand feet of a giant passenger jet. Now, just to be clear, the airline did not tell the TSB that there was a wind shear event due to any malicious intent. They probably just passed on to the TSB what the pilots had told them, and the pilots genuinely thought that a wind shear had caused this upset. That's why they flew on to Montreal. Had they believed that the plane had a fundamental flaw, then I doubt that they would have pushed on to Montreal despite it being so close. So they looked at the flight in detail, and that's when they realized that the captain of Flight 211 was quite new to the plane. He only had about 100 hours on the A310. The first officer on Flight 211 was a more experienced captain who was supervising the captain. The captain in training had not done a whole lot of low visibility takeoffs, as the captain could only do these takeoffs, and he had been a first officer for the past 10 years. On that day, the RVR, or the runway visual range, was at 1,800 feet. For those of you that don't know, the RVR is a measure of how far down the runway you can see when you're standing on the runway. Due to the captain's experience level, he needed at least 2,600 feet of visibility to take off. So they were like, hey, the first officer is more experienced. He is rated to take off in RVRs as low as 600 feet. So they went for the takeoff. Now, that sounds great and everything, but here's the thing. Under these conditions, the check captain, or the first officer, had to be the one in control of the plane. We now have one of the pieces for this accident. Then, remember that one last-minute departure change that was made as the plane was taxiing? Well, in this case, that added to the workload of the pilots right after takeoff. They had to do a whole lot. On top of that, they were doing an SRS, or a speed reference system takeoff. Then, during the takeoff run, the first officer's headset got unplugged. This meant that the rotate call was delayed a bit, and since the plane was picking up speed faster than they expected, rotation was made 44 knots above the VR speed. This meant that the plane was ahead of the curve when it came to speed during the takeoff. Here's an example. Due to the higher takeoff speed, the plane hit its maximum speed for flaps 15 right after takeoff instead of a few seconds after takeoff. Thus, the captain's main focus was on making sure that the plane did not overspeed. This basically disrupted the flow of how things should have gone in the cockpit. During all of this, the captain pulled the nose of the plane a bit higher to keep the speed in check, but as they climbed, the pilots did not select the climb setting on the TRP, or the thrust rating panel. That was an important step because if you did not do that, then the engine thrust would not be reduced and they'd stay at a higher power setting. For Flight 211, that was a bad thing. At this point, usually the autopilot would be turned on and the autopilot would level the plane off. But this plane was really hauling at this point, and the autopilot would not be capable of leveling the plane off at the assigned altitude. That's why the captain turned off the autopilot. Now the onus of leveling the plane off was on the captain. He pushed the yoke forward, but he needed a bit of help, and so he used the trim. Trimming the nose down sent the trimmable horizontal stabilizer from 0.3 degrees of nose down to 2.7 degrees of nose down. Without knowing it, the captain had put the A310 into an out-of-trim condition. Now, since they were focused on other things, none of the two pilots realized that this had happened. With that, the plane was headed down and the captain was pulling back and using the trim to right the plane, but his efforts were not enough. During all of this, the captain was desperately trying to save the plane. Here's where the next big mistake was made. As the plane was descending, the captain pulled back power, but at this time he accidentally activated the go-around mode by hitting the go levers. So, just to be clear, the plane was in a dive and he hit the lever that automatically brought the engines to max power. But that's more on the go levers, to be honest. The go levers were designed in such a way that it was very easy for the captain to inadvertently activate them. At this point, the captain was being hit by an insane amount of information. He was in manual control of the plane, and the plane was doing things that it shouldn't. The plane was almost at its speed limit, and that's not even counting most of the other things that the pilots had to deal with. As the plane hurtled towards the ground, the captain fell victim to what's known as a somatographic illusion. A somatographic illusion tricks the brain into thinking that you're pitching up when you're not. It's dangerous because if you don't have the right references, then you are at risk of pushing the nose down when you're already in a dive. In the case of Flight 211, the day was saved by the check captain, or the first officer. He could see clearly what was happening, and so he took control of the plane. and took the A310 back up to safety. It's scary to think what might have happened had he not been able to see things so clearly. But there's one more reason as to why all of this happened. Throughout this whole ordeal, it was as if the pilots had been caught off guard by how quickly the plane could climb. You'd think that their training would have prepared them for that. This discrepancy can be explained by the fact that the A310 simulator featured weaker engines than the real deal. The real deal had more oomph to it, if you will. In addition to that, the simulators could not really replicate things like cinematographic illusions. So, in a way, the pilots were really on their own. In the end, Flight 211 could have ended horribly had it not been for the quick thinking of the first officer. It was truly a narrow escape from disaster. If you want to watch another video about how contact lenses crashed a passenger jet, then the story of Delta Airlines Flight 554 might interest you. Link on your screen right now. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.